There were places in America where the dream wasn't just promised. It was built, brick by brick, ballroom by ballroom, swimming pool by swimming pool. Places where the wealthy and the hopeful and the celebrated came to forget, for a few days, that the rest of the world existed. They had names that sounded like monuments. They had lobbies that smelled like mahogany and money. They had orchestras that played past midnight and waiters who remembered your name. And then, one by one, something happened. The cars stopped coming, the lights went out, the doors swung shut for the last time, and no one came back to reopen them. What you're about to see are the 10 most haunting abandoned resorts in American history. Not haunted in the cheap sense, haunted in the real sense, haunted by the weight of what they once were. Each one is a ruin now. But every ruin tells a story, and some of those stories are still unfinished. If you drove north out of New York City in the summer of 1955, you'd eventually reach a valley in the Catskill Mountains where something improbable had been built. Not improbable in size, though Grossinger's was enormous. Improbable in meaning. Because Grossinger's wasn't just a resort. It was proof that a certain America was possible. It started with a farmhouse. In 1914, Selig and Malka Grossinger, Jewish immigrants from Austria, bought a struggling farm in Sullivan County and started renting out rooms to other Jewish families from the city who had nowhere to go. Not because they didn't have money, because most resorts wouldn't take them. The Borscht Belt, as it came to be known, was born out of exclusion, and Grossinger's became its cathedral. By the 1950s, the place had grown into a world of its own. 1,200 acres, a private airstrip, an Olympic-sized skating rink, a post office, a nightclub that hosted everyone from Eddie Fisher to Nelson Rockefeller. Rocky Marciano trained there before fights. Guests arrived in fur coats and left with sunburns and something harder to name, the particular satisfaction of being somewhere that was built specifically for you. It closed in 1986. The reasons were the usual ones: changing vacation habits, cheap airline tickets to Florida and the Caribbean, a generation that wanted beaches instead of mountains. But when you walk through the ruins today, the economics feel beside the point. The main building is open to the sky now. Vines have colonized the ballroom walls. The pool sits dry and cracked, its tiles still spelling out the name of a place that no longer exists in any meaningful sense. What's strange is how intact it still feels. Not as a functioning place, but as a memory. Like the building refused to fully collapse because the people who loved it haven't fully let go either. The mountains don't care, of course. They were there before Grossinger's, and they'll be there long after. But for a few decades, something remarkable happened in that valley, and the ruin that remains is the only evidence left. There is a photograph from 1960 that shows the Concord Resort Hotel's dining room at full capacity. Roughly 2,000 people seated at white-clothed tables under chandeliers the size of small cars. Everyone dressed, everyone present, everyone expecting something extraordinary. The Concord was, for a while, the largest resort in the United States, not by some modest margin, by a staggering one. 1,000 rooms, 3 golf courses, including one designed for championship play, a nightclub that booked Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and Liza Minnelli, a staff of 1,500. It operated at a scale that seems almost hallucinatory now. A self-contained city built for pleasure, hidden in the mountains of upstate New York. The guests who came there weren't just vacationing. They were participating in a ritual that the post-war American Jewish community had made into something close to sacred. You went to the Concord because it signaled something about who you'd become. It meant you'd made it out of Brooklyn, out of the Lower East Side, out of whatever poverty or precarity your parents had known. The Concord was a monument to arrival. It closed in 1998. The official story was financial. The real story was more diffuse, a slow erosion of the world that had made the Concord possible. The guests who had built their summers around it grew older. Their children vacationed differently. The building began its long surrender to gravity and weather and indifference. Today the main structure still stands, which is almost worse than if it had been demolished. A 1,000-room hotel going to seed has a particular quality of sorrow that a cleared lot doesn't. You can still walk the corridors if you're willing to risk the floors. You can still find the remnants of the ballroom, the ghost of the nightclub stage. 2,000 people at white tablecloths. Now not a single light in any window. Whatever math explains that transition, it's not the kind that adds up. Before Coney Island became a symbol of faded working-class nostalgia, before the roller coasters and the hot dog stands and the particular sadness of a summer crowd, there was something else there entirely. Something that the photographs barely do justice to. Because photographs can't capture the smell of salt air on an evening in 1890 when everyone around you is dressed in their finest, and the orchestra is playing, and the Atlantic is spread out before you like a promise. The Brighton Beach Hotel opened in 1878 on the southern shore of Brooklyn. It was a colossus, 500 rooms, a quarter-mile veranda facing the ocean, a dining room that could seat 1,200. It was reached by a steam railway that ran directly from Manhattan, and the train was usually packed. The Gilded Age loved Coney Island the way the Gilded Age loved most things, extravagantly, and with a studied indifference to how long it might last. The hotel's most famous episode came in 1888, when the owner, worried that the encroaching shoreline would eventually swallow the building, had the entire structure lifted onto railroad cars and moved 500 feet inland. 120 flat cars. 6 locomotives. The hotel didn't even close during the move. Guests stayed in their rooms and watched the ocean slowly recede from their windows. By the early 20th century, the clientele had shifted. Coney Island democratized, which was beautiful and inevitable, and also, in the economics of the era, meant that the grand hotels began to empty out. The Brighton Beach Hotel came down in 1924. What replaced it wasn't a ruin. It was simply absence. The site became a parking lot, then a housing development, then something no one thinks about anymore. There's something instructive in that. Not every abandonment leaves a ruin you can photograph. Some places just vanish so completely that even the ghost doesn't remain. What's gone is gone, and the world closes over it like water over a stone. Most abandoned places, when they're finally left alone, get stripped. Not always by vandals. Sometimes just by time, by weather, by the slow dissolution of everything that isn't structural. Fabric rots, glass breaks, wood warps and gives way. The interior disappears even when the exterior holds. Homowack Lodge is different. When explorers first entered the Homowack after it closed, sometime in the early 2000s, they found something that stopped them. The dining room was still set, not loosely, not symbolically, actually set. White tablecloths, silverware laid out in the correct order, glasses placed at the correct angle. Hundreds of place settings, in a room that could seat hundreds of guests, arranged as though the dinner service was an hour away. In the kitchen, pots were still on the stoves. Menus were still on the tables. In the rooms upstairs, beds were still made with the corners tucked tight. It looked, as one photographer put it, like everyone had simply walked out in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and never come back. Homowack was another Catskills institution. Opened in the 1940s, expanded through the post-war boom, catering to the same community that filled Grossinger's and the Concord. It wasn't as famous as those two, but it was solid, loyal. The kind of place families returned to year after year until the year they didn't. What happened at the end is unclear. The closure was abrupt enough that no one seems to have organized a proper wind-down. Whoever left last apparently left in a hurry, or with a strange conviction that they'd be coming back soon. And the building preserved that moment like an insect in amber. It's been decades now. The tablecloths have yellowed. The silverware has tarnished, but the place settings remain. Somewhere in the Catskills, A dining room is still waiting for guests who are never going to arrive. That image, once you have it, is not easy to shake. Not every resort that died was in the mountains. Some were in the cities, some were in the deep south, where the rules were different and the history was heavier, and the architecture of pleasure was built on foundations that the guests preferred not to examine too closely. The Admiral Semmes Hotel opened in Mobile, Alabama in 1940. It was named after Raphael Semmes, a Confederate admiral, a fact that in 1940 was apparently considered a selling point. The hotel was grand by any standard. 16 stories of Art Deco elegance rising above the Mobile waterfront. A rooftop ballroom. A dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the bay. It was, of course, segregated. The ballroom, the dining room, the pool, the lobby, all of it was white only until the Civil Rights Act forced a change in 1964. By that point, the hotel had already started its slow decline. The integration that the ownership had fought against turned out not to be the disaster they'd predicted. What damaged the Admiral Semmes was simpler. The interstate highway, which redirected commerce and visitors away from the old downtown core, and a series of ownership changes that left the building chronically undercapitalized. It closed in the 1980s. It sat empty for decades, a 16-story reminder of everything that Mobile had been and had chosen to remain, for too long, after the rest of the world had started moving on. The building was eventually renovated and reopened, which means it's one of the few entries on this list with something like a second act. But what it was before the renovation, that specific ruin, with its particular weight, is worth sitting with for a moment. Because buildings like that don't just decay. They accumulate. Every year of abandonment adds another layer to what the structure means. And what the Admiral Semmes meant, sitting empty in downtown Mobile, was something about unfinished history. About what gets preserved and what gets allowed to fall apart. About who the monuments are really for. By now, you may have noticed that a lot of these resorts were in the Catskills. That's not a coincidence. For roughly 4 decades, from the late 1940s to the late 1980s, the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York contained one of the most concentrated collections of resort infrastructure ever built in America. Hotels, bungalow colonies, summer camps, golf courses, nightclubs, an entire economy of leisure, constructed in a landscape that was otherwise just mountains and dairy farms. The Nevele Grande was one of its crowning achievements. The name, which sounds vaguely European, is actually just 11 spelled backwards, a reference to the 11 founders who built the original structure in 1901. By the time the resort reached its peak in the 1960s and 70s, the 11 founders were a detail lost in the mythology of the place. What remained was the Nevele itself, a 1,000-room complex with a covered pool, a bowling alley, a skating rink, a theater that booked national acts, and grounds so immaculately kept that arriving for the first time felt like entering a parallel world. The Nevele closed in 2009, which makes it relatively recent. Recent enough that some of the staff still remember their last day. The specific afternoon quality of the light, the particular silence that came after the last guests checked out, and the doors closed for what turned out to be the final time. The buildings are still there. The pool is still there, though it hasn't held water in years. The theater still has its stage, though the curtain rotted away. Someone left a piano in the ballroom. Whether by accident or as a kind of statement, it's impossible to say. It sits there, lid open, in a room that once held hundreds of dancing people. When the wind moves through the broken windows, you can almost hear something. Almost. Some resorts were built for the mass market. Others were built for a specific kind of American. The kind who had gone to the right schools, belonged to the right clubs, and understood that certain pleasures were not available to everyone and preferred it that way. The Cascades Hotel and Golf Club, built in the 1920s in the mountains of Western Virginia, belonged to the second category. It was an annex of the Homestead Resort, itself one of the oldest and most exclusive resort destinations in American history. And it was built to a standard that the word luxury doesn't quite capture. The golf course, designed by William Flynn, is still widely considered one of the finest ever built in the United States. The hotel itself was a study in restrained aristocratic taste. Stone and timber and long porches overlooking mountain streams, with an interior that felt less like a hotel than like someone's ancestral estate. The guests who came to the Cascades came for decades. Some families had been coming since the 1930s. There was a ritual quality to it. The same room, the same table at dinner, the same walks in the same woods at the same time of year. That kind of loyalty is its own form of love. And like most forms of love, it didn't protect the thing it was devoted to from ending. The Cascades Hotel closed in 2013. The golf course remains in operation, which means you can stand on the first tee and look back at the hotel building, empty now, windows beginning to go, and feel the particular vertigo of a place that's simultaneously alive and dead. The game continues. The building watches from the hillside. What was the center of something is now just a structure waiting to be decided about. In the mountains of Virginia, indecision has a cost. Weather doesn't wait for plans. Florida is different. Florida has always understood pleasure in a more aggressive register than the mountain resorts. Louder, brighter, less interested in restraint. The Diplomat Resort, which opened on the Hollywood Beach in 1958, was Florida's version of a grand statement. And Florida's grand statements have always had a certain quality. The feeling that excess itself is the point. The Diplomat was famous before it opened. The ownership had connections, political, financial, and in certain cases, connections that don't benefit from too much specificity. The guest list over the decades reads like a collision of worlds. Senators and studio executives, boxers and mobsters, celebrities who were genuinely famous, and celebrities whose fame was a more complicated kind. Deals were made in the Diplomat's corridors that didn't appear in any newspaper. Parties happened in its penthouses that didn't happen officially. The resort understood, in the way that certain Florida institutions have always understood, that the value it provided was not just sunlight and ocean air, but a certain reliable discretion. By the 1990s, the original Diplomat had been through multiple ownership changes, a bankruptcy, and a reputation that had shifted from glamorous to slightly menacing. The original building was demolished in 1999. What replaced it, a newer, shinier resort on the same site, kept the name, but shed the history. The old stories went with the old building. What got lost in that demolition isn't easy to quantify. It wasn't beautiful, exactly. Not the way the mountain resorts were beautiful, but it was specific. It was a place with a particular moral atmosphere, a particular relationship to American power and American transgression. And when it came down, that atmosphere went with it. The new Diplomat is fine. It's just a hotel. The old Diplomat was something more complicated and considerably more interesting. Something that the people who built it understood perfectly and preferred not to advertise. If you want to understand what the Catskills actually meant, not as a real estate category but as a cultural phenomenon, Kutcher's is where you start. Or rather, where you end, because Kutcher's was the last. It opened in 1907, which means it predated most of its famous neighbors by decades. It survived the Depression. It survived World War II. It survived the slow decline that took down the Concorde and the Nevele and Grossinger's, and dozens of others. For a while, it seemed possible, to the family that owned it, and to the guests who kept coming back year after year, that Kutcher's might simply outlast the trend, that there would always be enough people who remembered what it felt like to drive up those winding roads and arrive somewhere that felt, against all probability, like home. The basketball connection alone made Kutcher's legendary. The resort hosted a summer basketball camp that became one of the most famous in American sports history. Wilt Chamberlain worked there as a bellhop in the 1950s, and later played there in exhibition games that drew crowds that had no business being that size for what was technically a summer hotel. The athletic history of the place runs through the history of American professional basketball in ways that the sport has largely forgotten. Kutcher's closed in 2013. The family held on longer than anyone had a right to expect, driven by something that wasn't quite rational and wasn't quite business, but was something closer to devotion. The closure was quiet. There were no dramatic scenes. The last guests checked out. The staff received their final paychecks. The building fell into the particular silence of a place that has been listening for sounds that aren't coming back. The Catskill resort era lasted roughly 60 years. It produced a culture of leisure so distinctive that it has its own name, its own mythology, its own literature and comedy and music. And then it ended. Kutcher's was the last to go, which means it carries a weight the others don't. It wasn't just a resort that closed. It was the period coming to an end, the last light going out. There's a particular grief that attaches to the last of something, not just for the thing itself, but for everything the thing represented. When Kutcher's closed, the Borscht Belt was finally, officially over. Not fading. Over. Everything on this list has been building towards something. Not toward the most famous resort. Not toward the largest. Toward the one whose story contains all the others. The one whose ruin is not just architectural but historical. Not just nostalgic but indicting. The one that tells you something true about the country that built these places and then walked away from them. The Cavalier Hotel opened in Virginia Beach in 1927. It was magnificent. 7 stories of red brick rising above the Atlantic, with a rooftop ballroom, a private beach, a polo field, and an interior that photographers of the era described as the finest on the eastern seaboard. The guest list in its first 2 decades read like a who's who of American wealth and influence. F. Scott Fitzgerald stayed there. Adolph Ox, Judy Garland, 8 sitting presidents. The Cavalier was not merely popular. It was consecrated. It was where American power came to vacation. What those guests did not see, what they were never meant to see, was the landscape that had been cleared to build it. Virginia Beach in the 1920s was home to a substantial black community along the ocean front. Homes, businesses, churches, a social fabric that had been built over generations. The development of the resort corridor required that community's removal, not through purchase and negotiation for the most part, through pressure, zoning manipulation, targeted demolition, and the quiet but absolute force of a society that had decided that certain coastlines were for certain people. The black community that was displaced from the Virginia Beach oceanfront didn't disappear. It reconstituted itself further from the water, in neighborhoods that had less access, less value, less visibility. The Cavalier rose on land that had been cleared of a world, and the guests who arrived through its grand entrance never had to think about what had been there before. The hotel declined after World War II. A second modernist tower was added in the 1970s in an attempt at revival, an architectural choice that, in retrospect, seems almost self-defeating, as though the new building were embarrassed to be next to the original. By the 1980s, the old Cavalier was struggling. By the 1990s, it was empty. For 2 decades, the original building sat vacant on the Virginia Beach oceanfront. It became a landmark of a different kind, not of elegance, but of absence. The community that had been displaced to build it was gone. The community it had been built for had moved on. What remained was a structure too iconic to demolish and too complicated to easily restore. The Cavalier was eventually renovated and reopened in 2018. Beautifully done, by most accounts. The ballroom gleams again. Guests arrive through the grand entrance again. If you stay there now, you can look out at the ocean from a restored room and feel briefly like you're inside something timeless. But the land underneath it has a history. The cleared neighborhood has a history. And the renovation, however meticulous, didn't restore that. It couldn't. Some things, once removed, don't come back. Not the buildings, not the businesses, not the particular texture of a life that was built there over generations, and then was told to go somewhere else. The ruin that mattered at the Cavalier wasn't the one you could photograph. It was the one that happened before the hotel was even built. The visible decay, the broken windows, the peeling paint, the years of silence, was only a reflection of something older and less photogenic. Something that the elegant guests in the archival photographs were never asked to consider, and that the current guests are still largely not asked to consider. That is what these places are, finally. Not just ruins, not just nostalgia. They are evidence. Evidence of who built the dream, and for whom, and at whose expense, and what happened when the money ran out, and the beauty went to seed and the world moved on. Every resort on this list was once someone's idea of paradise, and every paradise, it turns out, has a cost that someone paid, and a ruin that someone eventually inherits. The cars don't come anymore. The orchestras have gone silent. The pools are dry. And somewhere in the American countryside, in the mountains and along the coastlines, the buildings stand and accumulate their silence, waiting for someone to ask what they meant and brave enough to hear the answer.